How are y'all doing? Still with me?
Yeah.
The Sunday after Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, he was set to preach a sermon, the title of which he had sent on to the church secretary. And so it has been recorded in history that the last unpreached sermon of Dr. King was entitled, "Why America is on the Road to Hell." Now, contrary to the narrative told of an arc of his life that had peaked in the passage of the Civil Rights Act, of a dream realized, instead, the last year of King's life brought his most revolutionary, and some would say his most threatening work, that was left to be largely unfinished. 50 years after his death, some are remembering the prophecy he spoke and the unfinished work that could have led King to believe that we as a country were on the road to hell. In December of 1967, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. announced his plan to launch a Poor People's Campaign in the spring of the following year, 1968. His position was clear when he made that announcement. Poverty was not some isolated issue. It was a global crisis. The world, he said, had been through a technological revolution and a revolution of weaponry, and it was King's position that it was also undergoing a human rights revolution. By March 1968, over 50 multiracial organizations had converged with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Tom Hayden of the Newark Community Union was there, as was Reyes Tijerina of the Federal Alliance of New Mexico, John Lewis of the Southern Regional Council, Miles Horton of the Highlander Center, Appalachian volunteers from Kentucky, welfare rights activists, California farm workers, and organized tenants were among the participants. Together, this group that had never been brought into one place and one moment and one time with a call before them, crafted an economic bill of rights, demanding $30 billion annual appropriation for a real war on poverty, for congressional passage of full employment and guaranteed income legislation, a guaranteed annual wage, and for construction of 500,000 low-cost housing units per year until the slums were eliminated. Thus, the Poor People's Campaign was formed with 3 phases. A city called Resurrection City was to be erected in D.C. to demonstrate the diversity of the movement and the reality of the impact of poverty. Phase 2 was public demonstrations, including civil disobedience in the form of Gandhi, Thoreau, and Jesus. Phase 3 was a nationwide boycott of major industries and shopping areas to prompt business leaders to pressure Congress into meeting the demands of the campaign. Phase 1 was set to launch at the end of April. Y'all still with me?
Yep.
On April 4th, 1968, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Phase 1 of the campaign continued on April 29th, and Bobby Kennedy became a key proponent of the campaign. On June 6th, Bobby Kennedy was murdered. The campaign did not go on to Phase 2 or Phase 3. And in classrooms across the country, within just 2 decades, Martin Luther King Day would be celebrated with many waving the banner of work complete, of a dream realized. But when Dr. King announced the campaign in December, he had identified what he said were 4 evils core to the moral degradation of American society: poverty, the war economy, systemic racism, and environmental decimation. These, he said, were interrelated And we would never see justice so long as we treated them in isolation. He said until we dealt with all four in concert with one another in a fusion movement of faith, we as a country would continue to see struggle and strife, death and pain. Now, when Dr. King announced the Poor People's Campaign and said that we were in a situation of crisis, at that time, the average CEO made 24 times the salary of the median pay of a worker. Now, when you poll Americans today, they believe that this number should be around 7 times as much. They think that's fair. On average, when you ask them what they think it is today, they will tell you about 40 times as much. It's 204 times as much. When you consider a CEO of a large corporation in contrast to a factory worker, it's 829 times as much. In 2011, the median income for Black households was about 59% of the median income for white households, up slightly from 55% in 1967. But when you consider wealth, so that's everything you own, not just income, right? Including home and retirement savings, the difference actually has grown. So when we started collecting data on wealth in 1984, we found that the median Black household had about 9% of the wealth of its white counterpart. In 2011, that had dropped to 7%. Some of you know I've been doing my work for my doctorate, so I fly out to California for 5 days. It's a burden that someone has to take on in January, and so I do. Some of you might know my topic, but I suspect others don't. I'm exploring the values that underpin free market capitalism in the United States and how those values have impacted progressive communities of faith. So I began my work 3 years ago by thinking that I needed to focus on contemporary phenomenon like entrepreneurial ministries and how business models were being absorbed into progressive communities of faith. But the further that I began to dig, the more that I found interesting pieces of the puzzle. Going back to preachers in the 1930s and 40s who described heaven as a banker's office. Those who connected to Unitarians among them. And then I started to dig a little further. And I found Unitarians and Universalists who believed in endless progress and human capability to control the natural world and the market, and who espoused a manifest destiny and ownership of the world. And then I dug a little deeper to theologies that were built to support slavery. Did you know that the very nature of baptism was altered to explain how someone could be capital and still be human and baptized? Mm-hmm. The very nature of what it meant to be a member in the church during the American slavery period was changed to condone slavery. Think about that. Finally, I got to this idea of chattel during American slavery, movable property that was composed of people. And I began to study how it shaped the theology of Protestant churches and how many of those values that we think of as long ago have been transmitted into contemporary community. And I began to feel that this dehumanization, this chattel theology, was not something of once and long ago, but was present ever more in our culture and even in me. It was present in the realities of racial divisions and injustice. It was also present in the classism that made me shrivel at poor white folks with disdain. It was present in my heart as I valued efficiency and numbers over relationship and people. And I realized that this massive thread had wound its way around my life and the lives of those before me, of what it means to be successful, of what it means to be cut off from one another, to participate in a zero-sum game. It shaped my grandmother's life, who never finished 6th grade and cleaned the floors of foundries to help her family after her husband was laid off and never got another job. It was all too real for her daughter, my mother, who mended holes in shoes and drank watered-down milk. It nearly strangled my father, who climbed the social ladder to be a leader in the world of finance, only having to be brought in to lead massive layoffs across the country. And eventually to tell many of his closest colleagues one day that they too no longer had a job. It strangled him with constant travel to China, no time with our family, and with a sorrow that seemed to haunt him into retirement. I faced it when I left home as a teenager, several times sleeping in a car, bouncing around on couches, hiding the history of my poverty at Harvard, and trying desperately in Unitarian Universalist congregations to make sure no one knew the poverty that I had struggled with or the debt I still carried. And I faced it once more as I watched my siblings in struggle shot at on the streets of Charlotte, North Carolina, as they protested peacefully, and the officers charged with protecting property over people released tear gas at them and rubber bullets, and I saw it in the struggle for their humanity in the eyes of those officers as tears fell down their cheeks when they had killed one of those protesters. In the last years, beloved, I have come to see how our economic system today is strangling people on all sides. And I have not known where to go. When I speak about my sense of injustice, especially economics and my project in theology, people respond to me almost immediately by saying, well, Robin, you know socialism didn't work either. In the words of Heldar Kamara, when I feed the poor, they call me a saint. And when I ask why they're poor, they call me a communist. I know socialism didn't work. But could there not be a third way? Have we that great of a poverty of imagination that there are only two options, neither of which reflect our values? Could the community of faithful across the country claim our common affirmation and the dignity and worth? Think about that. Our claim in that first principle of the worth in every human being. What would an economic system that centers the worth of every human being look like? Could we not feel a moral revival that reminded us of our rightful place, that in truth none of us are owners of anything but perhaps our own thoughts and dreams and bodies, and that in truth, how can any human being own land or another person or all of the resources of this earth? This land that we built right here, for example, was once gathered by anybody know the name of the tribe that was here? Lenape, who were driven from this land, driven into small corners, many of them killed. And none of this is to say you have to live in a heap of despair and guilt for being human and inheriting a crappy system. Pardon me, live stream audience. But rather, it is that you don't have to accept choice A or B when both are wholly incompatible with what it means to be a person of faith. I began to see, beloved, that wealth and class structure, that these aren't ways in which we are meant to see one another, that we are meant to be. And I'm not preaching against the 1% here because it would be counter to our faith to do so. I'm preaching for the 100%, for all of us. I've seen how this system strips the humanity away from everyone in the system. And I want to resist the idea that a savior, the right politician, or the right hereafter, the right leader will rise up. On December 4th, Reverend Dr. William Barber and Reverend Liz Theo Harris and organizational leaders from major anti-poverty initiatives and faith traditions across the country, including the president of our association, Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, announced the launch of a Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. In a season of divisions and statistics that seem insurmountable, in a history of the struggle, and in an environment of abject dehumanization, the Poor People's Campaign has given me a ray of hope. The Poor People's Campaign launches the day after Mother's Day this spring, and it's going to end on the June solstice. Reverend Barber and Reverend Liz keep speaking about how this movement, starting the day after Mother's Day, going through solstice, is about birthing light. Some of you know that at the beginning of 2017, Valerie Cowan, organizer with Revolutionary Love, asked, what if this time of darkness in which we find ourselves collectively as a country is not a time of the tomb, but a time of the womb? And I keep thinking about that. And so I thought I'd tell you what little I know of birth, because it's something I may think about occasionally lately. And how we are called now to be midwives for the United States that still can be. For the country of outward beauty and inward truth, we're truly open to the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. That country is not here yet, friends. And she is going to require some labor. And here's what I know of labor. The first thing that can happen in labor is it's really easy to look for someone to blame for the discomfort of labor. So we are going to need to be cautious in this time of labor, of birthing a new country, on who we start to blame for the discomfort, the transition, the shifts that happen when a new world is trying to be reborn. The second thing I know that's really important during labor, beyond ice chips, is to have focus. You have to learn how to breathe. You have to practice how to breathe before you get into labor, because in the midst of labor, you forget everything. You forget how to breathe. And so you have to learn a particular way of breathing. And in this country, we have forgotten how to rise up as a movement of people. We've forgotten the practices of civil disobedience. And so we are going to have to learn again how to breathe together in a process of change. And as the time comes, we are going to have to remind one another when we forget, when we lose the rhythm, when we lose the pace, when we start to give up. I know this of labor. There will be a moment of absolute exhaustion when you, or we collectively, say, never mind. I'd rather not like to do this today. Maybe tomorrow. And that is going to be the most critical moment. And this is the role in a movement of people of faith. to hold steady, to remind one another what we know yet can be. Now, in this metaphor, you could put it all on one person, and a lot of narratives about birth do, and I don't want to underestimate what that person does, I'm just saying. But the truth about labor is that a lot of people are helping make it possible. Someone has to be there to encourage when to push and to have the knowledge of when to push, or things can go very wrong. Someone has to be there to help remind the person to breathe. And then there are all manner of folks who simply wait with a measured intention and expectation, knowing that the word martyr, did you know this, that the word martyr, and Dr. King's been called a martyr, finds its origin in the word witness. One of the most important roles in the process of birth are those who bear witness. Who is this new child? What is this new world if there is no one to witness it, to call it by name, to raise it into being? Some of us, in truth, will not see this new world grow into being. I was recently talking with a colleague who's much older than I am, approaching retirement. And he, like me, was ordained at 25 and began this ministry very early on in life. And I was talking to him about all the changes and things that have been happening. And I said, well, what do you think of these changes? Is it just too much and you think it's absurd and it can't be? And he said, I've really struggled with realizing that the world I'm going to leave for my children is likely not better than the world I received. And that in the time that I have left, my role is like being on a sinking ship. My role is to get as many people in a lifeboat as I can, and then to push it away from the boat. And it broke my heart, and I wanted to make him feel better, to say something that would make that untrue. But my friend is a wise mentor, and over the years has given me good counsel on the reality of things. And I think what he was saying is, I'm learning to reckon with the truth that I won't see the better world for which I work today. And yet, I still work for that better world in all the days I have left. That's a hard reality to live into. And I don't know how you do it without being in a community of faith. I don't. Antonio Gramsci writes, the old world is dying and the new one is struggling to be reborn. And will we then, the question begs, step into help, to birth into being a new world? Or on this edge of transition, will we stop and turn away? There may not be a choice between socialism and capitalism that we particularly like at the moment, but there is a choice in movement right now, and it really is this simple. Do we breathe and push? Do we hold a hand? Do we stay in it even when it terrifies us? Do we blame others and scream, or do we focus and do the work that needs to be done to believe in the world that can be? Will you breathe and push? Will you breathe and push?
Oh, yes.
Are you ready for some labor?
Yeah.
a labor that liberates, and maybe a world that you won't see. Are you ready for a journey that has very few rewards, very few guideposts or maps to be given, except for the movement of the human soul and the knowledge that sorrow may last the night? Weeping may seem insurmountable in the darkness, but joy comes in the morning. So may we look for the dawn that emerges.